All right, welcome to your online lecture in lieu of class this snowy day, Thursday, February 7th. We'll go through Chapter 2 in 4 short videos, followed by 2 discussion questions per video in the form of a message board. So don't forget to answer those, and then bring any questions you have about the content to class next week. So let's dive right in. The learning objectives for this particular chapter are to list the basic steps of the scientific method, mostly as it relates to nutrition research as a broad topic. And you'll understand what that means as we go through the sections today. Discuss ways that scientists conduct nutrition-related research that involves human subjects. Identify common red flags that are signs of nutrition misinformation, and describe how to identify reliable sources of nutrition information. So let's get started. Nutrition really is a science for consumers, which is a little bit confusing. That can be kind of a confusing subject. In the past, nutrition facts and recommendations were often based on intuition, common sense, conventional wisdom or tradition, or anecdotes. Today, registered dietitians and other nutrition experts discard conventional beliefs, explanations, and practices when the evidence obtained by the current scientific research no longer supports them. A great example of this is the evolution we've seen over the past few years with regards to looking at fat as a nutrient. You may remember, or not, depending on how old you are, but in the 80s and 90s, fat was really demonized as a nutrient, and the big fad was a low-fat diet because we thought that eating fat made you have more body fat and made you have increased risk of heart disease. Now we know that that is really flawed logic, and there's a whole lot more to that conversation. And we'll talk more of the specifics as we get into our whole week talking about fat, but that's one of the good examples most recently of traditional or conventional wisdom to lower your fat grams being overturned by current evidence. So let's talk about what that means. As we collect science-based evidence, nutritionists and scientists follow a very specific method to conduct an experiment. Using natural and physical observations to test a very specific scientific question. There are a lot of safety and ethical concerns that have to be addressed in the appropriate manners in order for an experiment to be taken seriously. And we always follow a similar process as far for controlled experiments with, for example, a new drug or a new vitamin or mineral study. There's a very specific process that goes through, that researchers go through before trying out a new vitamin or mineral supplement or drug on humans for safety reasons. So this is the outline of the scientific method. There's 8 steps. We'll go through each one of those in a little bit greater detail today. So step 1 is to observe. Usually this happens, for example, in a hospital. Someone on the oncology ward might notice that as they collect dietary information from patients with stomach cancer, those patients tend to consume a lot of charcoal grilled meats. That's kind of an interesting observation. So there's something in the environment that triggers a little bit of a question in the mind of a researcher. And that is the second step, developing a question based on your observations. So noticing that hospitalized patients patients with stomach cancer have tend to eat more charcoal grilled meats. Might lead someone to wonder if eating charcoal grilled meats increases stomach cancer risk. So from there, they'll do lots of different types of experiments. One which might be to isolate a certain compound that's only found in charcoal grilled meats and determine if that particular compound increases stomach cancer in lab rats or mice. You'll notice here I don't know why my mouse isn't coming up. But you'll notice here in this B section that the potential question is very specific. It's not broad, like, does charcoal meat raise cancer risk? That's too broad. We're looking more specifically at this very special compound, only in grilled meats, whether it increases incidence or development of specific type of cancer in a certain amount of time, compared to lab mice who have not eaten chemical X. And that specificity is important. So the third step is to test or conduct an experiment. And in an intervention study, a controlled experiment, there's always a treatment group or an experimental group and a control group. So in this particular study, they've divided their two groups of mice in half. Half of them will undergo the treatment. That's the experimental group, so they'll be exposed to chemical X. The other half will not undergo treatment, but they'll live in the same quarters. That way, there's something to compare the treatment group to. And then step 4 is to collect information. So once you design your experiment and begin, you have to collect data at regular intervals about each participant. So in a weight loss study, for example, if the question is whether this particular program can help patients in losing weight, researchers would collect data on those patients and specific intervals on every patient. And then step 5 is to analyze those findings. So they'll review all of the data that's been collected at the specific points in time and analyze them using comparative statistics. And this part, it can be a little bit complex. I'm giggling because statistics are such an interesting part of our world now. They're sort of thrown around all over the place, and there's a lot of ways to make statistics sort of massage data to make it look more favorable than it actually is. So this is a really important step in the process and requires a highly trained statistician or researcher to determine what kind of statistical analysis is appropriate to use and to figure out, based on the population or the study subject number, what's going to make the most sense to try and answer the question. Step 6 is to review the data analysis and see if they can come up with any conclusions. So it looks like here, based on the picture, they found that the mice who had consumed chemical X were 3 times as likely to develop stomach cancer than the mice in the control group. So that's a pretty significant conclusion. And then by using those data analyses, health data, weight gain or loss data in a weight loss study, consumption of chemical X in this particular study, and gastric cancer incidence would be the main things they would probably follow in this case. They would attempt to answer the original research question, whether or not chemical X actually increased incidence of gastric cancer. And then the final step in the process, or I'm sorry, not the final step, but the second to last step in the process is to share those results, because we can't come to any broad conclusions as a scientific community if we don't know about each other's studies and results. So preparing an article and publishing it in a peer-reviewed journal is the best way to, that is a good hallmark of a study that's well known, it's been conducted well, and the results are important. So a peer-reviewed article, or peer-reviewed journal rather, is kind of a magazine of research articles where other scientists in a similar field review submissions to the journal, and then determine whether or not those submissions have been properly written, whether the data was analyzed in an appropriate way, and they really just determine whether or not the study is worth sharing with their community. And then step 8 is to conduct more research on the same or a similar question, because one study's conclusion does not mean we have the answer to the broader question. Just by studying whether or not this particular chemical raised gastric cancer incidence in mice does not mean that it will in humans. That means that this is potentially an area of concern with nutrition, and that more research needs to be conducted on that area. There are lots of individual biases that can occur during research studies, and so we need to make sure as scientists that we're taking those into account, and other scientists are attempting to replicate our work so that the public and public health officials can make appropriate recommendations. So, again, one study's conclusion does not mean we have the answer to the scientific question. You'll see this a lot in the news, not necessarily because they're trying to mislead you, but because they're usually not very well versed in scientific research, and also they want clicks. So just because one study, for example, said that butter lowers blood sugar levels does not necessarily mean that butter lowers blood sugar levels. That means one study found that. When I see a large review of studies showing that butter lowers blood sugar levels, then we'll talk about it. But just one particular study doesn't really mean a lot, because there are a whole host of other variables that can contribute to blood sugar levels. Maybe in the study, the participants ate more butter because they were eating a whole lot fewer carbohydrates, in which case, of course, their blood sugar levels are going to be lower. I'd like to see their cholesterol levels. I digress. In any case, that's the scientific process. So make sure to answer the 2 discussion board questions at the end of this video.